Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. You are tuning in to another episode of The Left Lens. How are you all doing this afternoon? I am joined by Economist Michael Hudson, as you can see here. I am very honored to have him. How are you doing this afternoon, Michael?
Pretty good. Weather's nice, sun's shining.
Indeed, indeed. So we have a lot to get to. So everyone, you know what to do. Be sure to like the stream as you're coming in. Hit that share button and share it around where you can. Subscribe to this channel. And of course, if you want to support this channel, you know where to go. Go to the links in the description. Patreon.com/Danny Dhaiphong being the best place. But let's get right to it, Michael. I'm going to pull up. You have a new book that has recently released called The Collapse of Antiquity, Greece and Rome as Civilization's Oligarchic Turning Point. I'm going to pull up your website. Everyone can find this link in the description of this video. But this book traces the roots of this creditor oligarchy. And right now, there is this banking collapse. We've had a few banks in the United States collapse. There's a lot of concern after Credit Suisse was absorbed by UBS, the Swiss bank. And there's a lot of worry in the financial markets among these large monopoly creditors. What is going on? How does your book help us understand how we got to this place?
Well, what happened in Greece and Rome is very much like what is happening today. And there's a common denominator in all of the Western financial systems. Debts grow by compound interest. That is, any rate of interest is a doubling time. They sweep up steadily. And the real economy grows much more slowly. So that debts mount up without the economy being able to pay them, and there's a crash. Well, before you had Greece and Rome, you had 3,000 years of Near Eastern civilization realizing this, and periodically, every new ruler that would come to the throne in the Near East for thousands of years would simply wipe the slate clean of personal debts and start all over in balance, because they realized that if you didn't cancel the debts, then you would have your citizens falling into bondage, have to work for the creditors, lose their land to foreclosing creditors, and all the land would end up in quite a few people, the hands of just a few creditors who would usually overthrow the government and try to take over. Well, what made Greece and Rome and all subsequent societies down to today's United States so different is they didn't cancel the debts. They left the debts in place, and instead of having a ruler or some central authority able to stop an oligarchy from developing and taking over and monopolizing all of the money and all the land, there wasn't any central ruler. This is usually called democracy, but democracies for the last 2,500 years have not been very good at being able to check the rise in creditor interests. And that's why Aristotle said that many constitutions of the Greek states claimed to be democratic, but they were really oligarchic. And Aristotle said, well, under democracy, creditors begin to make loans, and the debtors can't pay, and the creditors get more and more money, and they end up turning a democracy into an oligarchy. And then the oligarchy makes itself hereditary, and you have an aristocracy. And unless members of the aristocracy say, wait a minute, we're bankrupting society, we're reducing the whole society to poverty, nobody's going to fight for us anymore because they're all in bondage, unless you have some member of the upper class or some family taking over, like Cleisthenes did in Athens in 506 BC, then you're going to have what happened in Rome, a dark age. And the dark age is when the creditors take over and reduce all the rest of the economy to bondage, like in or what today you call it austerity or debt deflation. So what's happening in the banking crisis today is that the debts grow faster than the economy can pay, and so when the interest rates finally began to be raised by the Federal Reserve, this caused a crisis for the banks. And the result is that Silicon Valley Bank is, and the other banks that have gone under are just the tip of the icebergs. When interest rates go up, that makes the market price of bonds and real mortgages much less. So think of a bank as creating credit on its computer. It creates loans to make out, mortgage loans to make out, or loans to businesses. But in fact, the people have been withdrawing their money from the banks in the last few years, in the last 2 years especially, because interest rates are going up. What happened at Silicon Valley Bank is the same thing that's happening at New York banks, at banks all over the country. Banks are paying depositors 0.2% on their deposits. Depositors can simply, if they want, take their money out of the bank and buy government U.S. Treasury notes paying 4%. So if you have enough money to make it matter how much interest you get, of course you're going to take the money out of the bank and buy Treasury notes or money market funds or something yielding more than the bank will pay. Silicon Bank was making enormous profits by not paying depositors anywhere near what it was able to charge its clients. And so when the depositors began to withdraw their money, as they've been withdrawing it throughout the whole U.S. banking system, how is the bank going to pay? Well, banks invest their money in mortgages and government securities, and the Silicon Valley, they bought long-term mortgages when interest rates were on government bonds were very low, only 0.1%. The bank was able to make an arbitrage profit by paying depositors 0.2% and buying a long-term government bond at 1.8% for 30 years. Well, the problem is that when the interest rates went up, ostensibly to create more unemployment and to prevent wages from rising by bringing on an even deeper recession than we have now, the bank had to sell these Treasury securities in order to pay the depositors, and it had to sell them at a loss. And all of a sudden, the observer, the bank depositors and others, noticed the fact that while Silicon Bank reported all of its assets as what it had paid for them, 100 cents on the dollar, it actually, when it had to sell them, they were only worth 70% on the dollar. So throughout the whole U.S. economy, banks can report their balance sheet, report their assets of what they paid, and when interest rates go up, the market price goes down. So all throughout the U.S. economy, banks have said that they have more assets backing the deposits than they can ever realize by actually selling them on the market. So you have a basically fictitious set of economic reportings, and the depositors at Silicon Valley Bank and other banks said, well, this is a very tenuous situation. Let's just take our money out. And the result is that Silicon Valley had to sell what it had, report losses, and essentially was insolvent. Well, the real question is, how many banks in America are insolvent? Whenever interest rates go up, this threatens banks with insolvency, because that's how the financial system is structured. And the only hope of the financial system to avoid insolvency, which it had way back in 2008, was for the Federal Reserve to flood the economy with credit and inflate the economy. And that's what the Federal Reserve quantitative easing was all about. Low interest rates immediately raised the price of bonds, of real estate and stocks. And the Fed has said its job is to protect the banks. Its job is to protect the banks by inflating the economy, inflating not the economy really, but inflating the asset markets, inflating the bond market, inflating the stock market. These are the markets that are owned mainly by the wealthiest 10% of the population. So if you look at the American economy since 2008, when the Obama depression began, real wages have been drifting downward. But the wealth of the upper 10% has gone way, way upward. And that's as a result of the inflating the capital markets by the Fed while it's trying to deflate the labor market. The Fed said we want to support stock prices by making companies more profitable. And we do that by creating a depression. So if we can throw 2 million Americans out of work, then people will be fighting for jobs, and it'll be easier for employers to prevent wages from rising. The job of the Fed is not to promote employment, but to promote unemployment, to create desperation among the workers so that they really can't keep up their wages with living standards. And we're in the same kind of slow crash that you had in Greece and Rome, and that you always have in almost any financialized economy, where all the wealth is sucked up to the top, and there's a transfer not only of income, but of property, of real estate, of stocks and bonds, of companies, to the creditor class. And that's what we're having today. The creditor class in the U.S. is very much like the oligarchy in Greece and Rome, or in under feudalism, except that that class today is no longer a landlord class, because rent is for paying interest, and it's a financial class, not a landlord class. And all of this, if you look at where did all of this legal system come that makes Western civilization so different from the rest of the world? Well, it's that Western civilization has a pro-creditor law that turns out to be a law that favors a minority at the top, instead of trying to preserve overall economic growth, which was the objective of economic takeoffs from the Bronze Age, from Sumer, Babylonia, to the first millennium, to the Near East, to Asia, for almost every country outside of the West. So we're seeing a division between the West and the rest of the world finally today that is very much like what you had 2,000 years ago.
No, I mean, that's a fascinating connection, and honestly, I haven't heard many people make that connection, and it's very compelling. You mentioned the Fed, and Jerome Powell has been on record probably more times than I can count, talking about this anti-labor policy that has been a reaction to, or perhaps very interconnected to, all that has transpired over the last several years, leading into these bank crashes and the bank runs. Could you talk more about that policy? Why is it that the Federal Reserve is so interested in telling us that they want to lower wages, increase unemployment, despite the fact that this feels like maybe you could talk about the comparison to 2007, 2008 too. When that crisis happened, the United States government bailed those banks out and basically didn't punish them. And it was the people who were, suffering from subprime mortgages and other ills of this massive credit and debt issue. They were not bailed out. So what is happening? Why is the Fed seemingly attacking the living standards of ordinary people, while the banks that are creating the problem are seemingly doing very well right now? How is the Fed doing that?
Well, the problem's not only the Federal Reserve economists, it's the whole academic economic theory that's being taught today. Today's economic theory it's junk economics, basically. It imagines that the root of all inflation is labor wanting more wages. And the solution to any inflation, and in fact to any economic problem, is to pay labor less. This is the kind of junk economics that came out of the University of Chicago, the monetarist ideas of Milton Friedman, and it goes back to Austrian economics in the late 19th century. It was an anti-labor theory of how economies work to oppose to socialist theories of how economies work, and in fact to try to tell people again and again that the root of every problem is labor getting greedy and wanting to survive and wanting to protect its living standards instead of being forced further and further into debt. Well, let's look at economic reality. As I think all of your listeners know, what's certainly in the news every single week for the last year has been what really has caused the inflation. There are a number of things. For instance, America's sanctions against Russian oil and food exports. It blocked Russia's exports of oil, and Russia had accounted for 40% of the world's oil trade, and even larger proportion of its gas trade, and much of its agricultural crop trade, grain trade as well. Well, once this oil and gas and food is taken off the market, energy prices have gone up, food prices have gone up, and that's one major cost. Another major factor is the fact that the economy in America and Europe is becoming much more monopolized. And the monopolies have simply been raising their prices, especially the agricultural distribution monopolies that buy from the farmers and sell to the grocery stores and the other big distributors. The monopolies, really, their costs have not gone up very much, but they say, well, the Fed's talked so much about inflation being a problem that we're anticipating that inflation is going to be another 10% next year, so we're just raising the prices. So they've increased their prices way over the cost of production to make super profits. And in fact, the monopolies in the US have been making super profits, which is why the stock market has not gone down, unlike the bond and the real estate markets. And talking about real estate markets, there's been a huge 20% increase in the cost of housing in the United States. And again, that's because of the policies that were put in place by President Obama. His staff, Obama and Treasury Secretary Geithner, really forced the economy into what is an unavoidable depression by bailing out the banks, and instead of writing down the junk mortgages in 2009 and 10, instead of writing down the mortgages to the realistic market value, Obama evicted 8 or 9 million American families, primarily Black and Hispanic families, or low-income families, and they had to sell the houses. And meanwhile, the Federal Reserve was lowering interest rates, enabling private capital firms like Blackstone to come in and begin buying up all these properties, along with other capital firms that became absentee landlords. So the result is that since 2008, homeownership rates have fallen in the United States from 59% in 2009, way back to now, they're below 50%. Less than half of Americans own their own homes as a result of monopolists buying tens of thousands, millions of homes as investment. So the American economy is shifting from a middle-class economy where people own their own homes to a absentee-owned landlord-run economy, run by the landlords essentially borrowing from the banks in a kind of symbiotic relationship. Economists call this the FIRE sector: finance, insurance, and real estate, all together. So this decline in home ownership, increase in absentee landlordship, monopoly power, and the American sanctions and economic and now military war against Russia, China, Iran, and their allies is what is really pushing up wages, pushing up prices much faster than wages have come up. If wages are much less than the rate of inflation, you can be sure that it's not wages that are pushing it up. But the Federal Reserve economists are taught in school that there's almost no description of actual statistics in students who get a economics degree today. There's no economic history taught anymore in the curriculum, as it was in the 1960s when I was in graduate school. There's not even a history of economic thought, so that you don't get the concept of economic rent and exploitation that the 19th century was all about, from Adam Smith and Ricardo and John Stuart Mill and Marx up through Thorstein Veblen and people like that. Essentially you have economics sort of trivialized into just a few generalities that have become really part of the class war. And what the banks and the 1% have discovered is if you can prevent people from knowing what is actually causing the inflation, if you can prevent them from looking at actual economic statistics, if you can get economic history and thought out of the curriculum, they're willing to believe that there's no alternative, because all they see in the mainstream media, in the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, all they see is the same propaganda statement. All of our problems are become labor is making too much. Well, the real problem is that labor is making so little that it's not able to buy the goods and services that it produces, because it has to pay higher mortgage costs, it has to pay higher credit card costs. This week, the Federal Reserve announced that the average credit card debt in the United States was $10,000. So the average credit card holder owes $10,000 in debt. If you pay your credit card regularly, the rate's 20%. If you if you have a late fee or you're behind, then it goes up to about 30%. All of this is counted as a growth in the GDP. The late fees that banks charge, and they make even more in late fees and penalties than they make in interest, at 20%, is called financial services in the GDP, as if the banks are providing a service of charging their cardholders a much higher interest and penalty rate. So you could say that not only are the bank statistics fictitious, but the whole GDP accounting format that counts finance and landlordship and economic rent is part of the product, even though it's unearned income. It has nothing to do with production. Even though interest and rent are charges that should be subtracted from GDP as economic overhead, they're counted as part of GDP growth. Likewise, when people get sicker under COVID, and when they have to pay higher medical costs and medical insurance, the 18% of GDP is simply the medical overhead that they have to pay, as if somehow the economy is growing when people have to pay more for their health insurance programs or when they get sick. So it's a kind of inside-out economy, and I think I went all the way through graduate school without anyone ever mentioning once how GDP statistics are actually put together, or what really is causing inflation. It was all said to be the money supply. Well, most of the money supply is supplied by banks, not by the government. The banks create credit, and they create credit to buy, mainly to buy assets already in place. 80% of bank credit is for mortgage loans, now often to commercial property developers, absentee owners to buy property, as well as families to buy property. If you look at the paper this week, a lot of banks that have made loans to commercial property developers, that is big buildings, the big buildings are operating at only 60 to 70% capacity, certainly here in New York. And a lot of the mortgages are falling due this year and next year. And so now people are worrying, well, if the building owners, the absentee commercial owners, are simply going to walk away from the building because they owe more on the mortgage than the property is worth, then the banks are going to be stuck with yet more assets that are worth less than they had lent out and less than they owe the depositors. So you're having a run on the bank in the United States for the last week. People are taking their money out of the small and medium-sized banks, and they're putting them into the large banks, Chase Manhattan, Citibank, Wells Fargo, the banks that were the most crooked and responsible for the bank crash of 2008 from the junk mortgage class. Because the government has said these banks are too big campaign contributors to fail. That's too big to fail. If you're a big campaign contributor, you've given enough money to the heads of the Senate and House subcommittees on banking that you've got your guy in there as a lobbyist. But the too small to bail out, meaning too small a campaign contributor to care about, didn't. I'm sure none of your listeners have had a voice in who's going to be appointed to the head of the Democratic or Republican congressional committees on money and banking. And the way that the Democratic Party is organized, every committee head has to contribute a given amount of campaign money that they raise to the Democratic Party to promote its development. Well, you can imagine who are the largest contributors to the political campaigns to enable the heads of the committees to buy their chairmanship of the Senate and House committees. Well, Wall Street and the banks make sure that they give enough money to a politician who's on the banking committee, that they have their guy, whether it's oil and gas or agriculture monopolies or industrial monopolies or information technology. They will also give money to the candidates that will essentially act as lobbyists for them, and that's what politicians are in the United States today. They get elected by raising money, by finding political backers who they're willing to support their position as lobbyists in Congress. Well, Silicon Valley was one of the major mainstays of contributors to the Democratic Party. So you can imagine the Silicon Valley private capital funds that were the major depositors of over $250,000 at the Silicon Valley Bank. You can imagine that the government is going to do everything it can to serve their interests. So, of course, they were bailed out instead of wiped out, as should have been the case, and in fact would have been much better for the economy if they would have been wiped out. When you wipe out the large deposits and a bank goes under, you wipe out debt. And what America needs, and what you could say what Western civilization has needed since Greece and Rome, is the kind of debt cancellation that kept Near Eastern economies growing for thousands of years before Rome took over the West.
Yeah, those are all, I mean, great points. And I think it might be appropriate now actually to move into, you sent me this great article in speech by Sergei Lavrov last week for a Russian magazine, The Intelligence Officer. And he talks about how multipolarity is an emerging trend. And it feels like the global South, Russia being one of the major countries, are moving away from this sort of neoliberal financialization that has, I mean, you talked about $10,000 average debt, Michael, in the United States. Roughly half the country makes $30,000 per year. So when you're talking about an average debt of that much, you're talking about people really underwater. But if you could talk about what Sergei Lavrov said, why is it significant in terms of what's going on today? Because we have a lot of developments that have just broke in the last few days, 24 to 48 hours, that I feel like are very related to what he had to say. So I'll let you take it from there.
Well, Lavrov actually said the exact opposite of what you described him as saying. It's not that the other countries are withdrawing from the dollar area. It's that the dollar is driving other countries out of the dollar area. It's begun by long already in 1954 by grabbing Iran's overthrowing the government. And then after the Shah fell, it grabbed Iran's savings in the United States. But most recently, a year or two ago, it grabbed all of Venezuela's savings, its gold supply in the Bank of England. But most seriously, last year, the United States said, we don't like Russia has refused to sell its oil and gas to American buyers. Therefore, we're grabbing all of its money in the West, $300 billion. And we're grabbing it because we want to bankrupt Russia. Our intention is to bankrupt Russia and divide it into 5 states so it can never sort of become a strong military country again, and especially so that it cannot support China, which we also want to divide into a few states. So it grabbed Russia's money after and threatened to cut Russia, China, and other countries off from the SWIFT electronic bank clearing system so that their banks could not relate with the United States. And it raised an iron curtain, not to contain Russia or China and Iran, but an iron curtain around Europe to prevent Europe and other English-speaking countries. We can call them, Lavrov calls them the golden billion, the white population of the world, as opposed to the Russia and which is now considered racially and ethnically non-white by the Ukrainian Nazis. Basically, it's declared economic and social war against the whole rest of the world, and is isolating it with the sanctions that you've seen against Iran, Russia, rising sanctions against China over TikTok. America has said, if China develops a new technology in the United States, we insist that it sell its technology to Americans. We have to monopolize all information technology so that now that we've deindustrialized the American economy, we can live without industry simply by monopoly rents if we control the patents of information technology and chemical patents and health patents for pharmaceuticals. Then we can just live on our patent rights as if we're landlords. And in fact, monopoly rent, patent rent, and the rents from TikTok are very much like land rents. And this was the whole point of Adam Smith and John Stuart Mill and Ricardo in the 19th century, that America wanted to be a rentier economy. So Lavrov explained that, well, we've been isolated, and he said, we made a mistake in how we looked at the West. Even though NATO continued, despite the promises in 1991 that NATO would be dismantled if Russia dismantled its military alliances. Lavrov said, we thought that we had security in the fact that we were providing gas and oil and other raw materials to Europe, and it was becoming prosperous as a result of its economic ties with us. And we thought that this mutual gain of trade was going to ensure that there wouldn't be any hostility. And he said, we were surprised that you had last week the German foreign minister, Baerbock, saying that the German leadership finds it more important to support Ukraine. She said it's more important to support the Nazi party there, more important to promote the right wing Ukrainian government than to have European and German prosperity or what the voters want. Ms. Baerbock said it doesn't matter what the voters want. We're here to support Ukraine because she didn't add that she'd been put in place and nurtured for a decade by American financed non-governmental organizations that have found opportunists like her to promote their career, promote the career of people who are willing to, once they're in office, represent American foreign policy instead of their own voters. So there's a kind of, America has pulled a color revolution at the top in Germany, Holland, England, and France. You have essentially where the foreign policy of Europe is not representing their own economic interests. It simply has said, we are committed to support a war of what they call democracy, by which they mean oligarchy, and including the Nazism of the Ukraine, against autocracy. Autocracy is any country strong enough to prevent the emergence of a creditor oligarchy, like China has prevented a creditor oligarchy, and like Putin in Russia has been able to check the kleptocrats that were sponsored by the United States in the 1990s, and to say to the kleptocrats, well, you can keep the money, but you have to support pro-Russian policies, not simply sell out your oil to American companies to take over. Oil and natural resources are Russian companies. We're not going to lose our national patrimony on that. So Lavrov wrote really a very eloquent article. I'll read you one sentence that he said was, we no longer have any illusions about converging with Europe, being accepted as part of the common European home, or creating a common space with the EU. He said, all these declarations of European capitals have turned out to be false. He said, the latest developments have clearly shown that the ramified network of mutually beneficial trade, economic and investment ties between Russia and the European Union were not a safety net. The EU did not think twice about sacrificing our energy cooperation, which was the pillar of their prosperity. We've seen that the European elites have no independence and always do what they are ordered to do in Washington, even if this results in direct damage to their own citizens. So what he explained in this article was that the mistake that Putin and the Russians made was believing it was, I think, a legacy of their Marxist materialist background. They thought that the politics of all countries was going to reflect the economic interests of their countries. And it did not dawn on them. They couldn't quite believe that Europe and other countries would support a policy that was directly against their economic interests, like refusing to buy Russian oil and gas, which meant ending the entire German steel industry and the glassblowing industry and the fertilizer industry, all of which required gas imports from Russia. So the sectors that had the German economy that had made Germany the leading dominant nation of the European Union are wiped out. And the only choice of European steel companies and other companies is to move to the United States. One doesn't know what's going to happen to their labor force, but obviously there's going to be a crisis here. So, and you're having similar policies in Holland, in France. You're having all these countries not acting in their own economic self-interest. Well, where does that leave the materialist approach to history when you're doing something like that? It's a surprise. And Lavrov said the global majority countries, where some 85% of the world's population lives, are not willing to pull chestnuts out of the fire for their former colonial parent states. And so last week you had a big meeting between the Russians and Africa. Next month you have a big meeting of African countries in St. Petersburg, Russia. You're having countries essentially being driven out of the American empire by the American policy of trying to have all or nothing. And you could say that, well, wait a minute, American policy also isn't really helping its economy. America had been getting a free ride internationally by the dollar standard. All the money that it spent on building 780 military bases around the world, pumped dollars into the economy, into foreign central banks, and they recycled this money to the United States, largely by buying Treasury securities and just resending it back. And the Americans printed more money than it can ever afford to repay, just like a bank owes depositors more money than it can pay when it's the value of its mortgages and investments goes down. The United States, now that it's deindustrialized, has no way of paying foreign countries the dollars that the money that it's run up in their own currency. In other words, if countries said we want to take the hundreds of billions of dollars that we've invested and we want to take it back into our own currencies or into gold or into something else, America doesn't have the means to pay. And there's a recognition that this policy of building up debt has not only imposed debt deflation on the American economy, not only pushed the American economy into a chronic austerity and depression, but it's driven the whole world to pull away and use its economic benefits for itself, such as I think yesterday, France announced that it was going to now buy gas and oil from China and pay in yen. You're already are having other countries denominating their trade no longer in dollars. It's not that they're withdrawing; it's that the United States has driven them away because China is afraid to get any more dollars. It's worried that since President Biden has said that we're in a 20 to 30-year war against China to decide who's going to rule the world, American democracy or Chinese autocracy, meaning efficient industrial production versus deindustrialization. Obviously, China thinks, well, we better save ourselves from having the fate that occurred to Russia. So that's what's happening. What's happening in the world, and that you're getting. I think it's Lavrov who's explained this more clearly than anyone else. You get in his speeches and those of President Putin just a feeling of disgust with the West, and they're really disgusted at having been suckered into believing that Europe was going to act in its own self-interest instead of acting as a political and economic and military colony of the United States.
Yeah, indeed. And there's a lot of developments that have come out of, you mentioned France, but there's a lot of others, even just in the last 24, 40 hours to speak to. But before we get to that, could you speak maybe briefly about, you talked about Europe kind of shooting itself in the foot, going against its own economic interests, in Russia, in many countries now realizing this. But on the other hand, there's a lot of connections. Oftentimes what you'll hear is that Wall Street, the financiers, the finance capital really benefits from war. Is that the case when it comes to this increasingly aggressive move to push out countries like Russia, like China, to push them away? Who benefits? Is finance capital benefiting, and how?
I don't think you can say finance capital benefits. It's just the opposite that's happening. It may be that banks that lend money to the major military industrial complex benefits, but finance capital would benefit much more with active world trade. Banks traditionally have made, ever since the Middle Ages, have made a substantial part of their earnings on financing international trade through short-term collections outstanding, trade credit that you need. You need banks to play a role when you're importing from some country to make sure that the money is going to be there and the money will be paid when the product export is actually delivered. Banks make money on financing international investment. So if you have a move to autarky, that doesn't help the banks. After World War I, when you had the government, U.S. government, insisting on inter-allied debts to the point that it broke down Europe and kept the debt flow going only by lowering interest rates and creating a stock market bubble that broke in 1929. That didn't help finance. So finance really doesn't help benefit by war. And this war is not being led by the financial sector. It's led by the neocons that have a completely different motivation for war. It's a real visceral hatred of Russia. And this is it's not an economic hatred. It's an ethnic hatred of Russia, and just an emotional hatred of Russia, and followed by a race hatred of China that's always been as American as apple pie. You'd think that there would be some financial interests that oppose the war. And in fact, what's surprising is that the anti-war movement in the United States is not being led by the left. It's being led, it's by, who are the big anti-war people? Mainly the libertarians, the Republicans, Donald Trump. Where is the left? Not Bernie Sanders. He supports Biden and Ukraine, not by the Democratic Party. The question is whether Trump and other people Republicans are going to try to make the 2024 election precisely one of saying, well, if you're for the American prosperity, including employment for American wage earners, we've got to end the war economy. Whereas the Democratic Party said it's worth cutting back Social Security here. It's worth cutting back medical support, Medicaid, and social spending in order to fight the war. Military spending is sacrosanct, and the war is essentially what our State Department, our CIA, and the Federal Reserve under Miss Yellen is all about. And this is going to be very interesting. This is the first time, I think, when it's not the left that's in favor of the war, although if you look at World War I, it was the peace groups and the left that were the first in almost every country to applaud the war, except for Jane Debs and the socialists in America, and Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg in Germany. The social democratic parties were all for the war, and you're having that again today. Who would have thought that it would have been a party calling itself the Green Party that's the leading belligerent pro-war party in Germany, and the social democratic parties throughout Europe that are all for the war? Again, we're not in a reflection of economic interests anymore, but political interests, and it's I don't know whether you'd call it an ethnic war or what you'd call it, but whatever it is, it's a national hatred of Russia, China. Maybe it's just of the other. Maybe it's just of any foreign country that the United States does not control. It looks at as an enemy, and if it's unable to exploit it, it looks at that as being a threat to its very identity.
Yes, indeed. And that trend you talk about, the social democrats, or we could call maybe the establishment left, even for like Josep Borrell comes to mind. He's a part of a socialist workers party in Spain, but he is maybe one of the most enthusiastic promoter of the white man's burden of all things when it comes to this war that they are waging in Ukraine against Russia. But you just mentioned, how the world is reacting to this. And now we have like really what I think are important developments taking place. Over the past several months, we've had Saudi Arabia talk about interest in BRICS. There are rumors that they're going to join BRICS sometime this summer. They've just joined, or they've just approved the decision to join the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And now you also have Brazil announcing Lula had to cancel his visit. He was going to visit this past week, but he had the flu. But they just announced a trade deal with China where they would trade specifically in RMB, or Chinese yuan, instead of the dollar. What is your reaction to these developments? First off, just what comes to mind for you?
Well, they go hand in hand with the fact that the global South countries, especially Brazil. By the way, Lula is going early next month to China. It was the pneumonia they had, I think, not the flu. They are in a squeeze today, especially now that the rise in the Federal Reserve's interest rate has increased the dollar's exchange rate. All these global South countries owe very heavy dollar debts, and they can't afford to pay these dollar debts, and at the same time pay more money for their imports of oil and gas and food. So what are they going to do? Are they going to go without energy and turn off the lights and restrict their diets just so that they can pay foreign creditors, or they're not going to pay the foreign debts? Well, China has been playing a very active role in Africa and other countries, offering credit for Chinese exports on much softer terms than the United States, of not foreclosing or not calling countries in default, and indeed is backing a debt write down. Well, you can see where all this is heading at a certain point. We're not there yet, but China will say, well, you owe a lot of dollar debts that are pushing you into austerity and pushing you into reliance on the International Monetary Fund that is even more anti-labor than the Federal Reserve. You can deal with us, and we'll have our imports, and we will have a mutually beneficial trade with you on easier credit terms, and that you can afford. Just, but we realize that if you trade with us, you'll be sanctioned, just as countries that traded with Russia were sanctioned. So why don't you trade with us, 75% of the world's economy, instead of with the U.S. and Europe dollar euro block that's only 15 to 25% of the economy. We'll take care of you, and that really is where the global fracture between the dollar bloc and other blocks are going. The Western creditors and bondholders are saying, well, wait a minute, if we're going to wind down, have a debt write down, as occurred in the 1980s with the Brady bonds for Latin America debt write downs, then China has to write down its debts too. But China says, well, we've organized our credit as equity. Our credit is basically, again, for building ports, for building infrastructure that we've actually put in place that's going to be earning an income for the countries. We've made productive loans. The IMF loans, the World Bank loans, and similar bondholder loans are what's called odious debt. They're debt that does not help the client countries. The debtors earn the money to pay the debt with the interest, and it's debt that was negotiated by client oligarchies that were put in power and backed by the United States. This is the case especially in Brazil, because certainly at the time I was dealing on Wall Street with Brazilian foreign debt in 1990, over 30 years ago. Almost just about all of Brazil's dollar debt was owed to the domestic Brazilian oligarchy. It was Brazilians who held the dollar-denominated Brazilian government bonds. I suspect that's still the case because American and European bondholders felt burned by Brazil, Argentina, and other Latin American countries. So apart from a few vulture funds buying these debts at low prices, you have the domestic oligarchy, the domestic banking class, the financial class, the monopolist class, the old colonial class owning this debt. And since they're also the class that runs the central bank, and indeed for the government, they know they're going to pay the foreign debt because the foreign debt of Yankee dollars is paid to themselves. The Brazilian ruling class is the recipient of the Yankee dollars. So at some point, this debt crisis, certainly for countries like Brazil and I think Argentina also, are going to be involved, not necessarily a break simply with the US dollar, but with the domestic oligarchies that were client oligarchies of the United States. The oligarchies backed by the United States in overthrowing Lula years ago and replacing them with the dictator Bolsonaro, who's just returned to Brazil in the last couple of days. So you're going to have what is not only a global fracture, but it will finally be the domestic class war of socialism versus oligarchy. And that's the war that you had way back in Greece and Rome. That's why it's worthwhile seeing that all of these strains have occurred long before. They've occurred again and again. And you'd think that it would help to read a history of these strains and see what's worked out and what didn't work out. And in fact, the oligarchy almost always is won by violence. And that's been certainly the case in Brazil. I remember back in 1964, I met with Brazil's former president, I think Kubitschek, who'd just been overthrown, who told me and a few others who were with me the story and of what had happened, and just said, you have to live with it. This is America controls who's in control of Latin America. It's its backyard, and it only trusts dictators. It doesn't trust democratically elected leaders, because America is frightened that a democratically elected leader might represent the voters who elected him instead of the little U.S. embassy with envelopes stuck full of dollars and the army trained in the United States to overthrow democratic leaders. That's really the polarization dynamic that the whole world is facing today.
I want to actually bring up on that point a graph, an image that I think speaks to this phenomenon. And here, a lot of people are kind of surprised about Saudi Arabia's decision to diversify.
Is that the German flag?
No, this is the Saudi flag, I think. But it's so this only goes to 2021. But here you just see, in terms of trade volume with China, China is Saudi Arabia's largest trading partner. And here you have the United States. Over the years, since 2001, you've seen, especially since over the last 5 to 8 years, a massive shrink in trade volume between the United States and Saudi Arabia, while China has really grown in terms of its influence in terms of trade. Can you talk about, back to your points on, the changing global economy and the what's happening with the dollar, but also what you spoke about earlier in the stream with regard to finance and how things have transpired? What exactly explains how you said, the United States, it supported all these oligarchies? Many people in the West would say, well, Saudi Arabia is one of those kind of client states, but Saudi Arabia is now moving much closer and closer to China. What explains this? Why is this happening, and why is it happening right now?
Well, in 1945, when the United States put the post-war economic order in place with the IMF, the World Bank, and other organizations, the United States was the leading industrial country, as well as financial country. And its control of the world gold, it actually increased its gold holdings by 1950 to 75% of the world's monetary gold. So other countries were convinced not to issue their own fiat currencies. England was committed by the United States as a debtor not to devalue sterling to make its exports competitive. Other countries, pretty much in order to have access to money to recover, to fund their own economic recovery, and to buy industrial goods that they needed, had to rely on the United States. But since the epoch of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, the wealthy class in the United States, the 10%, found that it could make much more money by financial means than by industrial means. And in fact, corporate employers found they could increase profits not by lowering wages in the United States, but by simply moving their production facilities to China and other countries, Asia, and producing at lower wages. So the whole idea of free trade, especially under the Clintons after 1990, was an attempt to replace American industrial labor with Asian and other industrial labor, including the maquiladoras along the border with Mexico. Factories put just over the border to get low-priced, non-unionized labor, Mexican labor, as opposed to American labor. So you had a decision led by the Democratic Party to replace American labor with less expensive foreign labor, and under Clinton also to deregulate the financial sector and essentially turn what was a traditional commercial banking sector into a brokerage house sector, into financial gambling on derivatives, financial stock purchases, buying and selling companies. Money was made in the by over-industrial companies, not by expanding their profits and building more factories and machinery and hiring more labor to produce more. Money was made by going to Wall Street and buying money to take over companies, break them up, turn their real estate into gentrified housing instead of commercial use or industrial use, and essentially pushing the United States into what turned out, as if by a surprise, into dependency on other countries that are actually doing the production of the world. So now you have a critical mass of countries, 85% of the world's population, 75 to 85, saying, well, wait a minute, if we're producing all of the industrial products and raw materials that make industrial products, what do we need the dollar American and European rentiers for? What do we need American credit for if we can create our own credit, just the same way America does, electronically, just print it? That's modern monetary theory. What do we need foreign landlords and foreign owners of our raw materials from? The oil companies make big messes. They don't clean up the pollution they cause. We can just take them over and run mining and oil drilling in ways that are environmentally sound. What do we really need the United States and Europe for? What is its role? Well, the United States and Europe says, well, our role is to refrain from bombing you. Our role is not to treat you like we've treated Libya and Iraq and Syria. We can offer you not bombing you like we bombed these countries. That's all we can offer. And what do you think foreign countries think of that offer?
Yeah, it's a really bad one. I mean, it can get down to just that basic point there. It's really, you have the United States. That graph really kind of hits, I think, the nail on the head of that point of like, yeah, Saudi Arabia, despite how close it has been with the United States, it's not necessarily being offered more than what it's already received. And as China gains some more prominence, could you talk about actually, because China is really at the center of all of this. China is becoming the biggest trade partner for most countries in the world, Saudi Arabia included. Saudi Arabia is now making these decisions to diversify. So is Brazil, the BRICS countries, all these developments really have China at the center in a lot of ways, where the Chinese yuan is becoming increasingly important. How did this come to be? Because it wasn't too long ago where China was considered one of the poorest countries in the world. And now it's not only leading economically, but also a lot of these moves and developments have to do with diplomatic leadership and political leadership worldwide as well.
Well, two things. It's not only China, it's Russia. Saudi Arabia, for years, the great, what it wanted more than anything else from the United States was arms, military arms, especially when its Sunni leadership was thinking of military war with Shiite Iran. So the one thing that Saudi Arabia did depend on United States industry for was armaments, airplanes especially. And in the last few months, Saudi Arabia has begun to buy arms from Russia. And you can imagine what this does to how this has upset the American military-industrial complex, because this was where America basically was making enormous monopoly rents off its high-priced armaments. And other countries do not have such high costs as Pentagon capitalism does. Well, you can see what was happening with Saudi Arabia. It thought, well, America's always really wanted to control our oil industry, and it's always been threatening that it'll become our enemy if we make peace with Iran. Well, we want to make peace with Iran because otherwise Iran may blow up our oil fields, and they may sink a ship in the Gulf of Hormuz and prevent our exports from occurring. So the Saudi Arabians are deciding you never want to put all your eggs in one basket. They're diversifying, and that includes Russia. But also regarding China, America realizes, or Saudi Arabia realizes, that if for any reason Iran is pushed into sinking a ship in Hormuz to stop the oil trade, that there's another route to Europe. And the Chinese in the last few weeks have been talking to Saudi Arabia about a long roundabout sea trade route up through the Pacific, up to the Arctic Ocean, and then down through Europe from the north, not from the south and the Mediterranean. So that's one thing. But your real question, I think, was about why has China pulled ahead and not the United States? China is pulling ahead by doing exactly what the United States is doing in the late 19th century. It's pulled ahead by using an active government sector to subsidize basic needs. The United States in the 19th century, and this was all spilled out by the first professor of economics at the first business school in the United States, Simon Patton, who taught at the University of Pennsylvania. He said, the United States emphasizes a fourth factor of production besides labor, land, and capital, and that's public infrastructure spending, like the Erie Canal has made possible the grain exports, the Midwestern grain coming in to upstate New York and to the East Coast. He said that public railroads, public education, public health, all of this is the role of the government infrastructure is to lower the cost of living by providing basic needs like education, healthcare, a job freely, freely or at least at a subsidized cost. Well, this is what made American industry able to undersell industries that did not have as rapid as well-developed a public sector in Europe. Well, since Reagan and Thatcher privatized the public sector, now you have the public sector trying to make profits. The railroad system was privatized when the Butcher brothers of Philadelphia broke up Penn Central and separated all of the real estate from the railroad, and then sold off the real estate, leaving the railroads without real estate financing, and obviously the costs went way up. You had the privatization and carve up and breakup of the public sector in the United States. The costs went way up. That's why privatized healthcare in the United States absorbs 18% of GDP. Whereas even in conservative England in the 19th century, Benjamin Disraeli, the conservative prime minister, said, health, all is health, and wanted to provide health care. And after World War II, Britain's National Health Service was a model for the whole rest of the world. Now it's been Thatcherized, and especially under Tony Blair and the Labour Party, as usual, which has moved to the right of the conservatives, just as the Democrats are now to the right of the Republicans in the United States. Now it's all different. Well, China has kept not only kept basic infrastructure in the public domain, but it's kept the most important public utility in the public domain, banking. You have the Bank of China creating the credit. And the function of the Bank of China is not to create public credit for takeover loans, to take over companies, break them up, and reduce employment. It's to help the economy grow. It's the function of a government-controlled bank is to increase capital investment and employment and construction for housing to provide for the economy's basic needs. Well, that is what has enabled China and other countries that are following the mixed economy plan to outperform the United States. And that's what the United States says autocracy. The United States says China is an autocracy because it has public banking instead of leaving it in private hands to do to China what our banks have done to the American economy. So you can imagine how humorous, in a way, this seems. It's obviously, the autocracies are socialist countries with a mixed economy where the government provides public basic needs. Democracies don't. Democracies abolish the infrastructure, privatize it, usually selling it off to American or European buyers, and say that there's no such thing as a basic human need. Land can be a commodity to make financial gains from by charging rent that people have to borrow money to buy. There's no such thing as a public need for health. Health is not a basic right. It's a monopoly opportunity for pharmaceutical companies and health insurance companies to make enormous gains. Having a job is not a public right. And losing a job is a right of the financial and corporate class to create enough unemployment to keep wages down so that profits ostensibly can go up. So basically, a democracy is a country that lives in the short run for privatized financial gains, and an autocracy takes long-run planning into account and keeps planning in the democratically elected sector, not in the hands of the financial centers such as Wall Street, Paris, the City of London, or other banking centers. That's the real split of the world, and it's not democracy versus autocracy. It's financialization versus socialized mixed economies.
Yeah, indeed. All very good points. Michael, you've been so generous with your time. I have one last question about the Summit for Democracy and then two short Patreon member questions. Do you feel like you have time for those?
Sure.
I don't want to be rude about your time. Okay.
Okay.
I think, thanks. You know, the two Patreon questions are I think, well, they may not be brief answers, but, you know, you can answer as briefly as you'd like. But I wanted to ask you, because you brought up the autocracy and democracy narrative that the United States especially has been promoting. The Summit for Democracy 2.0, I guess you could say, is happening right now. Costa Rica, Zambia, and a few other countries are supposedly helping sponsor it. Of course, December, right? There was a Summit for Democracy in December of, I think it was 2021. I watched it painfully. It was very early in the morning. It was one of the worst things I think I've ever seen in terms of just television and entertainment, even in just politics. It was very canned. It was very superficial, but it's all up, you know, the Summit for Democracy is really, for the United States, it seems like a very important event that encapsulates something that you mentioned earlier about with the U.S. having nothing to offer. It's kind of pushing the world away. And one of the ways it's doing this is by this propaganda war. It's like a hyper intense propaganda war about the dangers of China and Russia and these so-called autocratic states versus the United States and the collective West, its allies, vassals, whatever you want to call them in the collective West. So they're pushing this hard. What's your reaction to this Summit for Democracy 2.0? How does it fit within this larger economic context that you have spoken about?
Well, it's being broadcast live on Zoom as we speak today. And it's very interesting. The center point of democracy, it says, is to support the Ukrainian Nazi class. Let me quote from you what it has a document that the third paragraph of the meetings that are being held as we speak. Here's what it says. We deplore the dire human rights and humanitarian consequences of the aggression by the Russian Federation against Ukraine, including the continuous attacks against critical infrastructure across Ukraine, with devastating consequences for civilians, and express our grave concern of the high number of civilian casualties. This is after 8 years of Ukraine bombing civilian territories in the Donbass, claiming that the Russians were subhumans. This was the Ukrainian treating the Russians as a race war, not as an ethnic war, but as a race war, as if Russians somehow were different, with Nazi insignia. The attenders of the meetings today are supposed to agree that we demand that Russia immediately, completely, and unconditionally withdraw all of its military forces from the territory of Ukraine within the internationally recognized borders and call for a cessation of hostilities. In other words, surrender. Well, why would countries go to that? And you had, it's true that India is there and Mexico is there, and but even India, Mexico, and Albania said we're not going to sign for that document. You know, we're going to come here because we want foreign aid and we don't want to be killed at one of your color revolutions in our countries. So it just, this is such blatant pro-Nazi propaganda. They've defined democracy as Nazism. Well, after all, that nationalism called itself National Socialism. So you see the Orwellian rhetoric of this whole thing. The United States, it's obvious that democracy is any country that supports the United States by definition, no matter whether we're dealing with a Latin American dictator or any of the other dictators. The coup d'etat in Ukraine is a democracy. It's just a charade. And in fact, this is why I think it's important to look way back at Greece and Rome. And when that is celebrated as a democracy founding Western civilization, what they mean is the oligarchic law that was also achieved by 5 centuries of civil war and violence. Every politician urging debt cancellation and redistribution of land, ending with the Gracchi brothers and with Julius Caesar, who the Romans feared were going to cancel the debts and free the debt bondage Romans. All of this is what democracy has been able to turn into. It's opposite throughout most of history, and we're just seeing that reenacted in Orwellian terms in this week's meetings. They're Zoom meetings, at least, so I can't say they're in Washington, but in the U.S.-sponsored meeting, where I think countries are showing up because they don't want to overtly insult the United States, but obviously it's a charade.
Yeah, and another attendee or representative, another representation at this Summit for Democracy is Taiwan. And there's a lot of controversy around that, given that Tsai Ing-wen is touring the United States right now to the tune of protests outside of here in New York City. But there are a couple of Patreon questions. One of them is good. It's by Morgan. And Morgan wants to know if you would agree that the U.S. dollar is backed by U.S. terrorism, and why, if so.
The U.S. dollar, the root from ever since the Korean War, ever since 1951, the entire U.S. balance of payments deficit was military in character. Overseas military spending is what has been pumping dollars into the world's central banks. And the dollars, for instance, spent in Vietnam were turned over to the local banks. And since Vietnam was a French colony originally, the Vietnamese banks sent the dollars on to France, where General de Gaulle would make a very conspicuous act of cashing them into gold every month. So literally, the dollar's role in the world has been supplied by its 780 military bases. And I guess you could call that terrorism. Let's just say military spending, and the military role is at the center, because that really is, I think, the main thing deterring countries from withdrawing from the dollar standard. The United States is giving them the service of not bombing them and not assassinating their leaders and not having a color revolution to overthrow them. That's what the United States can offer, not interfering with their elections unless they do something that the United States doesn't like not showing up, at least on Zoom, for the democracy meetings today.
And it reminds me of Ukraine, Michael, because I feel like Ukraine is such not only is it a flashpoint in this huge geopolitical struggle that the U.S. is imposing upon the world against Russia, this war, but also Ukraine's economy has been decimated. I think the IMF has just approved a $15.6 billion agreement to bail out Ukraine's economy, but it's essentially a failed state at this point. There really isn't an economy. Its budget is almost entirely, the government budget is almost entirely met by the collective West. What's your opinion on the Ukraine situation in relation to this terrorism?
Well, what's been destroyed is the IMF's credibility. The IMF rules say, number one, no more Argentinas since 1991. You cannot make loans to a country with no visible means of payment. Number two, as Articles of Agreement, you cannot make loans to a country at war. Making loans to Ukraine shows that this is an odious debt, literally an odious debt. It's a debt to a government that has come to power by coup d'etat, that is responsible for attacking and goading Russia into protect its Russian-speaking population from racist genocide by troops wearing the Nazi insignia, reliving World War II for the Russians. So the IMF loan to Ukraine gives the global South countries immediate reason to annul all debts owed to the IMF and the World Bank as agents of the U.S. subversion of their countries, giving them loans on conditions that instead of helping them repay the debt, they impose austerity programs that actually prevent IMF clients from repaying their debts. So this has completely discredited the IMF as a tool of, I won't say American fascism, but let's say as a tool of the U.S. military. It's as if the IMF is really operating out of a small basement in the Pentagon in Washington. So that's the major effect. Obviously, there's no way that Ukraine can pay. America, the U.S. government has said, well, we're holding the $300 billion that we've illegally grabbed from Russia. Oh, not illegally, we make the laws. The rest of the world may call it illegal. International law may call it illegal. But when America does it, it's not illegal. That's why President Nixon said, when the president does it, it's not a crime. Well, when America does something against international law, it's not illegal because we are the only democracy in the world's essential country. So basically, what's going to happen? I think Russia will say, ultimately, Ukraine's going to be divided. And the eastern and southern Ukraine up through just to the west of Odessa is all going to be a part of Russia. So I think Russia will probably smile and say, well, actually, we are willing to spend $300 billion to rebuild Ukraine. We're going to build the part of Ukraine that since 2008 has been systematically bombed and attacked under attack. And now is under attack by the Ukrainians, focusing on hospitals, on public, on civilian centers. So yes, we're going to spend the $300 billion on rebuilding the Donbass, the Luhansk region and the southern coast and Crimea. But we're going to spend the $300 billion ourselves. We don't want to have to spend it in the United States. We're going to spend it at home, and we're going to spend it in China and India and Iran, countries that are actually helping provide the construction work, the reconstruction work, and the building up of the infrastructure that will make Ukraine, eastern Ukraine and southern Ukraine, what it could have been had not the American neoliberals promoted the kleptocracy throughout the former Soviet Union in 1991.
Indeed. And I think this is the perfect question to end this interview on, Michael. For those who may not be aware, Patreon members, Substack paid members, and YouTube members, and all those links are in the description, can submit questions that I will ask at a certain point with my guests during our conversations. But Sean wanted to ask, this might be a good place also where you can plug your own work, Michael, to end our conversation. He wanted to ask about if you have a published list of books that we should be reading, maybe to what he calls the relative normie, like people he may know as well as himself. Like, what should people be reading? And I think it's a good opportunity also for you to talk about your own books, because you have quite a few that I think are very critical.
Well, there are not that many people writing along the lines that I'm writing. Steve Keen is writing along the lines. He's had Debunking Economics. That's a good book, and he has a Patreon website that has a lot in it. If monetary issues, the Stephanie Kelton and Randall Wray, my former colleagues at the University of Missouri in Kansas City, are worth reading. Stephanie just has a new book out. Richard Werner has written a lot of good books on economics. Dirk Besmer and I have written a number of articles together on in academic magazines on GDP analysis and that. And there are not that many people who are really writing along the lines that I'm doing. There are other websites to follow, like Naked Capitalism is a very good site. I got some of the ideas today from Amarant's Global South website that is very good on up-to-date information about U.S. foreign policy and war. Those are good. There are a number of websites about the Russian, the war in the Ukraine. SmoothX by Andrei Martyanov is very good. Moon of Alabama is very good. So things are happening so fast. It takes so long for a book actually to be published and printed that these current events are very important. Just the few books that I've said. I think reading history is very important. And so, but I don't know anyone who's writing much in history, because the history departments have all been closed down at universities and excluded altogether from the economics curriculum, as I mentioned. So there's really not very much. And Pettifor writes a lot on de-dollarization. Ben Norton has a very good site, and Radhika Desai and I have a fortnightly review on Ben Norton's site of what's happening with the geopolitical split in the world.
Very good. And I want to encourage everybody to go to the description of this video after I end here. I'm actually going to stay on for another 25, 30 minutes after Michael departs. But in the description of this video, you'll find his website, the link to his latest book, The Collapse of Antiquity, Greece and Rome as Civilization's Oligarchic Turning Point. So you can pick that up. And also his website is very easy to navigate, very user-friendly. So you can find all of his books there as well. Michael, thanks so much again for joining today. I really appreciate you taking the time out.
Well, it was a good discussion. I'm glad we did it so timely, just while the Democracy Summit's going on.
It seems like everything's going on in the last couple of days. That's kind of how it goes these days. Well, appreciate it, and we will be back in touch soon. Take good care. Have a good rest of your afternoon.
Bye-bye.
All right, everyone. You hear that siren? That means we're just beginning. You hear that siren? We're just beginning. Hit that like button, everyone. That was a great conversation. We have about 625 likes, 840 or so folks watching. Let's keep hitting that like button. It's a great afternoon here out on the East Coast of the United States. I want to cover one story. That is the Taiwan story. So you have the Summit for Democracy happening. You have all this de-dollarization happening. It's very exciting. And you also have pretty intense escalations coming from the United States and its puppets in Taiwan Authority, in the Taiwan Authority regional government that I'm going to get to in a second. But before I get there, not only like this stream, but please do support this channel. So the best way you can do so is becoming a member on Patreon at patreon.com/Dhaiphong. You can also become a paid member on Substack. Also sign up for that free newsletter, regardless if you can or cannot become a paid member. You can find that link in the description. We have a great YouTube community as well. So you can go hit that join button right in the title, right underneath the title of this video, right by the channel name, so you can join and become a YouTube member as well. Those are the best ways to support. And the reason why I ask to support this channel is because it helps keep this work sustainable. Also, I am due for some upgrades. I think I'm going to also have to get help in with the thumbnails. We have some transition happening on my side. So supporting this work helps with that, because I don't like to, as much as I really appreciate people's solidarity and them putting in their efforts to help my channel, I do want to be able to compensate people as well as compensate myself to be able to make upgrades and equipment and all of that. And the only way I can do that is through increasing the support that I receive. So thanks so much for everyone who's given super chats thus far. Before we start, if I am able to, I will shout you all out. But I want to get to a story, actually. I wanted to cover one last story. And hopefully I can make this 20-25 minutes for all of you. Make it concise. I'm going to plug in. Give me a sound check if there are issues with my audio. So I've plugged in now. Sometimes it goes bonkers. So give me a sound check as I continue to speak. Thank you all for sticking around. I'm going to get to the story in a minute after the sound check. Thanks again so much for your support, for your viewership, for those super chats. I saw them coming in. Thanks so much for your generosity. All right, let's get to it. So Tsai Ing-wen is in the United States. This is actually a high-profile visit in the sense that China is not happy about it. So, and this is understandable, because if you all remember, in August 2022, Nancy Pelosi's stunt visiting Taiwan and meeting with Tsai Ing-wen on official capacity violated one China principle. And so China was furious. It conducted military exercises, cut off a lot of different communication channels with the United States. And essentially, China has taken a much more harsh posture on this issue than even prior. So Tsai Ing-wen is right now visiting the United States. She's in New York City. She was met by protests outside where she was meeting. She's going to end up in California eventually, with rumors that she will meet with House Speaker Kevin McCarthy, the Republican House Speaker. And China has warned that there will be retaliation to this, because they see this as equally as dangerous as what happened during the Pelosi stunt. So you have that happening right now, where Tsai Ing-wen, this now completely and utterly rejected politician, she has resigned as the leader of the Democratic Progressive Party in Taiwan. And the reason why she had to resign is because her party lost the local elections in November of 2022 in a landslide. Essentially, the KMT, the Kuomintang Party, the old nationalist party, is now leading in the vast majority of localities in Taiwan's regional authority. And it is predicted that the DPP is going to suffer probably a major loss in the presidential election of January 2024. So Taiwan is once again in the news. You have the Summit for Democracy now happening. It's one of these events that is being used as a propaganda ploy to promote Taiwan independence. They are being represented there in an event where heads of state, right? And the key word is state here. Heads of state were invited. Taiwan has representation there. China has also rebuked at that. But I want to cover this story because China is offering a stern warning to the United States and to President Tsai Ing-wen in Taiwan. And she's dismissing it as she travels around the United States, acting as if she has the authority to do so as a head of state, right? So this is all really dangerous because the One China principle codifies the fact that Taiwan is a part of China, and a recognition of Taiwan independence is really the red line for China that will spark a war. That is when you will have China step in militarily. So the fact that she is doing this and she is rejecting what China is saying just goes to show how committed she is to the US's agenda for Taiwan, which is to spark a war against China. So Tsai Ing-wen has begun a 10-day trip, which will be the United States and Latin America, after vowing that the self-governing island will continue to engage with countries around the world and won't be cowed by Chinese threats of retaliation. External pressure, she said, will not hinder our determination to go to the world. We are calm and confident. We neither yield nor provoke. Mind you, just by doing this, it's a provocation. She's trying to say that she's not provoking anything by just heading over there and being calm, heading over to the United States and being calm, but in fact, she is provoking conflict here. Tsai made her comments after spokesperson for Beijing's Taiwan Affairs Office, Zhu Fenglian, warned that the visit would escalate tensions between China and its breakaway province if the Taiwanese leader met with U.S. officials during her travels. Quote, if she has contact with U.S. House Speaker Kevin McCarthy, it will be another provocation that seriously violates the One China principle, harms China's sovereignty and territorial integrity, and destroys peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. We firmly oppose this, and we definitely take measures to resolutely fight back, end quote. The Taiwanese president, or Taiwan's president, will reportedly also travel to Belize and Guatemala after making her first stop in New York. She's then expected to stop in Los Angeles before returning to Taiwan. Government officials in Taipei told the Financial Times earlier this month that Tsai will meet with McCarthy, the top Republican and the third-ranking person in the U.S. government, while she's in California. Taiwan will firmly walk on the road of freedom and democracy and go into the world, Tsai said on Wednesday. Although this road is rough, Taiwan is not alone. Well, in fact, Taiwan is kind of alone. Taiwan is Honduras has just recognized Beijing, has just recognized the mainland China as the rightful representative, as does 95% of the world's countries. Only a very small number of countries, Honduras being one of them at a time. Nicaragua recently also has cut ties with Taiwan, quote unquote, diplomatically. Taiwan is becoming more and more isolated because the world is recognizing UN Resolution 2758. It's also recognizing the US and China's joint communiques as being documents that codify this principle. I mean, it's international law. It's also a part of US and Chinese diplomatic policy. But the United States, of course, is in denial of this. So only Belize and Guatemala are 13 countries of the 13 countries. So Belize and Guatemala are among only 13 countries in the world that recognize Taiwan as a separate nation, have full diplomatic relations with the island. Another Latin American country, Honduras, served diplomatic relations with Taiwan this week so it could establish ties with mainland China. So a bit of a correction here. Belize and Guatemala, even though these countries have diplomatic relations, these 13 countries, they don't recognize Taiwan as an independent country. They recognize the Republic of China government as the government of China. So a little bit of history here. Up until 1971, so 1949 to 1971, 1949 being the revolution in China, which created New China. That development led to the KMT party, which recently swept elections locally in Taiwan. That party fled to what was Formosa, then called Taiwan, specifically fled there and governed there. And it was a very brutal governance system, by the way, brutal. But up until 1971, most countries in the world, because of U.S. pressure, recognized the Republic of China, which is what the KMT established as and called itself, even before the 1949 revolution. The Republic of China was considered the rightful government under international law of all of China, governing from Taiwan. That was because of U.S. pressure and sanctions on the mainland. So that is a little bit of history that I think might get a little lost in the way this is framed. So even these countries are not necessarily saying it's an independent country, because there has been absolutely no referendum in Taiwan that would make such a thing official, right? So no one recognizes Taiwan as an independent country, just to clarify. Another Latin America, so Honduras severed diplomatic relations with Taiwan this week so it could establish ties with the mainland. Relations between Beijing and Taipei have deteriorated since last August, when McCarthy's predecessor, U.S. Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi, made a visit to Taiwan in defiance of warnings for Chinese officials, and China responded by launching unprecedented military drills in the Taiwan Strait and cutting off defense ties with the United States. So Tsai Ing-wen is in the United States. She may meet with Kevin McCarthy. She has been met with protests. There were hundreds of people outside of where she is staying right now in New York City, protesting, saying, no, we are for one China, a lot of Chinese Americans in particular. So this is a hot button issue, and these escalations are pretty massive because it is coupled with the Summit for Democracy. And it's also coupled on top of, it goes in connection to what's actually happening in the world as the world moves away from the U.S. orbit, especially in terms of dollar dominance, especially in terms of diplomatic legitimacy and political legitimacy. Much of the world is saying the United States is not really where we want to go. We don't want to be under that umbrella, because all it does is cause suffering and chaos and crisis and catastrophe. And we're going to move more toward China. So this is really a retaliation, right? And the United States is trying to really get a kind of high ground politically and diplomatically here over China, and really raise the tensions and the stakes to the point of near war. I mean, this is what this kind of provocation could portend. It really could, especially since this is all building a foundation for what China says is its red line. It will forcefully reunify Taiwan with the mainland should the United States spark an independence referendum. That's the only condition where such a thing would happen. And the United States, by doing this, is pushing that. But earlier in the week, this isn't just China being provoked by the United States in this case. China is making its own kind of moves. And I want to show you what kind of moves these are, because you all know that China has been making incredible diplomatic gains in so many areas, whether it's brokering the Saudi-Iran peace agreement, whether it's by becoming the obvious and most influential possible broker in any kind of peace in Ukraine through a month of February, where it released a peace proposal, a global security initiative document, and had the historic meeting between Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, confirming that Vladimir Putin also considers Xi Jinping and China a serious diplomatic player that will play a role in whatever peace can be achieved, if it can be achieved, in Ukraine. But also with Taiwan, there was a big development. You had the former president in Taiwan's regional authority visit China, and this is what he had to say. We are all Chinese. He is a leading party member of the KMT, and he was the president in Taiwan's regional government from 2008 to 2016. That's former president Ma Ying-jeou. So he was visiting China on what was a historic trip, because this has not happened in the history of New China. So since 1949, you have not had the president of a regional authority government in Taiwan visit the mainland and take a tour. This was a statement after the victorious local elections for the KMT that they indeed affirm the one China principle, and China is ready to embrace that. So China is getting ready for the headwinds that are likely to come very soon, which is that Taiwan's regional government will change character. The KMT will likely come to power, and China is preparing for that, and it is ready to solidify the one China principle. And this, indeed, is much more powerful, much more influential, much more significant than anything the United States can do here. The United States meeting with Tsai Ing-wen is a provocation, is dangerous, but the United States is not in a position, especially with the Ukraine quagmire happening as we speak, is not in a position to try to thrust upon Taiwan Island the independence referendum, which Tsai Ing-wen and forces in the DPP are very much indeed keen on. They want such a thing. They are very much invested in this independence narrative and are willing to flirt with it. Whether they're ready for the consequences of that is a much different story. So we have this historic visit from the former Taiwan president of the regional authority, Mr. Ma Ying-jeou, and he toured many Chinese cities with the message that we are all Chinese, meaning that Taiwan is part of China and the people who live in Taiwan are Chinese. And so people on both sides of the Taiwan Strait are ethnically Chinese and share the same ancestors, said former President Ma Ying-jeou of Taiwan on Tuesday, March 28th, at the start of a historic visit to China that Taiwan's ruling party has criticized. Ma, in office from 2008 to 2016, is the first former or current Taiwan president to visit China since the defeated Republic of China government fled to Taiwan in 1949 at the end of a civil war with the Communist Party. He is visiting amid heightened tensions as Beijing uses political and military means to try to pressure democratically governed Taiwan into accepting Chinese sovereignty. So that's propaganda. China is not pressuring anything. This is law. This is international law. This is recognized. It's not China pressuring Taiwan. It's the fact that China is affirming what already exists, which is the one China principle. And it not only exists, but it is law. UN Resolution 2758 is law. The US-China joint communiques are law when it comes to those two countries, in the sense that they are agreements. They're agreements that were ratified, that were signed and recognized. Of course, Taiwan Relations Act that the United States passed in conjunction with it kind of undoes a lot of the US's actual accountability to the one China principle. But nonetheless, this has been part of how the United States has talked about China and Taiwan for a long time, since the 1970s, when Nixon and Kissinger helped broker the first communique. So Taiwan's ruling Democratic Progressive Party has questioned why he is visiting just after China took away another diplomatic ally, Honduras, on Sunday, leaving the island with official ties with only 13 countries. So again, China took away. China didn't take away anything. Honduras made a sovereign choice. And this is a choice that makes a lot of sense, given that Honduras wants to get on the Belt and Road. Honduras wants trade relations with China. And Honduras is not actually sacrificing if it has trade relations with Taiwan, because Taiwan, again, is not diplomatically recognized internationally as an independent nation. Again, it's important to note that none of these articles in the media, this is Channel News Asia, acknowledge the fact that these countries, these 13 left after Honduras stopped, that these countries do not recognize Taiwan as a nation. They don't. They recognize the Republic of China, which is supposedly the legitimate governing authority according to the Republic of China government in Taiwan. So that's a really big distinction that has to be repeated over and over again, because the propaganda will never tell you that, the Western propaganda. In comments in the eastern Chinese city of Nanjing at the Sun Yat-sen Mausoleum, where the man celebrated for overthrowing the last Chinese emperor in 1911 and ushering a republic is buried, Ma praised Sun's contributions. People on both sides of the Taiwan Strait are Chinese people and are both descendants of the Yan and Yellow emperors, Ma said in comments provided by his office. Ma used wording in Chinese meaning people of Chinese ethnicity rather than referring to their nationality. Descendants of the Yan and Yellow emperors is an expression referring to a common ancestor for the Chinese people. Most Taiwanese no longer identify as Chinese according to polls, which are very skewed, because there are other polls that show that indeed most people on the island of Taiwan, 80+% of them, affirm the status quo. So there's a bit of a contradiction there, right? And it's likely a contradiction in how these polls are conducted. But nonetheless, give it a shot, US. Try your best. See if the people who live in Taiwan are going to support a war for independence. I don't think so. Sun is officially still considered the father of the Republic of China, which remains Taiwan's official name. So again, propaganda. That's the constitution in Taiwan, is the Republic of China. That's what the regional government is called. That's a reflection of this longstanding history of the Republic of China, considering itself the governing body of all of China, not Taiwan independence. This is so important to remember. Sun is lauded by the Communist Party for the overthrow of the Qing dynasty, but the government Beijing and Taipei do not recognize each other. Ma's visit is part of an outreach by Taiwan's main opposition party, the Kuomintang, to China in hopes of reducing tensions. The KMT traditionally favors close relations with China, but strongly denies being pro-Beijing. Taiwan President Tsai Ing-wen has repeatedly offered talks with China, but has been rejected as China considers her a separatist. She says only Taiwan's people can decide their future. Ma, a senior KMT member, said he hoped for peace. We sincerely hope that the two sides will work together to pursue peace, avoid war, and strive to revitalize China, he said again, using an expression that refers to the Chinese people as an ethnicity rather than nationality. This is an unavoidable responsibility of Chinese people on both sides of the strait, and we must work hard. Ma is not scheduled to meet with any senior Chinese leaders on the trip. He and President Xi Jinping met in Singapore in 2015. So they do have a relationship. They've never met in the mainland China, however. So essentially, he says, we're working for peace. We need to revitalize China together, affirming the one China principle. And of course, this had Tsai Ing-wen mad because this has come in the lead up to this visit. So China has made a statement saying, yeah, we're going to work with anybody who affirms the principles of one China. We are not going to stand with or stand for what Tsai Ing-wen stands for. And yeah, Tsai Ing-wen and Xi Jinping have not talked. And the reason they don't talk is because Tsai Ing-wen has shown through multiple incursions and violations of the one China principle that she's not a serious actor. Tsai Ing-wen is what Zelensky is to Ukraine. Tsai Ing-wen is what Zelensky is to Ukraine. Tsai Ing-wen is the same kind of leader. What has Tsai Ing-wen done since she's been in office? Open arms to the United States with not just weapons, because that's been a long-standing trend of sending weapons to the island, but it's been massively escalated since 2016. But it's not just the arms, which Tsai Ing-wen has embraced and has said, let's militarize the island even further. But it's also even allowing the United States to quadruple its troop presence, to continue to have a really strong political influence on the island. Tsai Ing-wen is indeed a traitor to the Chinese people. That's what she is, just like Zelensky is a traitor to Ukraine. Zelensky has sold Ukraine off, and that's what Tsai Ing-wen is doing. So they're not serious leaders. And not only this, but Tsai Ing-wen is not a leader of a state or a country, unlike Zelensky, which, you know, a lot of people have arguments about how they came about in the fall of the Soviet Union. So indeed, there's still contention about Ukraine's national status despite its international recognition. But Taiwan, it's even further problematic in the sense that it is not considered internationally recognized as a official state. And so she is acting like Zelensky, but violating international law nonetheless. It's not just some indirect neo-colonial relationship. She is going against international law. So why would Xi Jinping, why would the mainland government entertain that? Because she's never shown, just like Zelensky never shows any real true overtures for peace. She's never shown it. She has not been willing to affirm the one China principle. She is not. And that's a big problem for China. That's a big problem for the People's Republic of China, because that's really a declaration of war, and China wants no part of that, which is why everything it has done up until this point has been peaceful. Everything it has done up until this point with regard to this question of Taiwan has been peaceful. So this is a massive escalation. Her touring around the United States, China has been ready to respond and is responding already with this move to invite the KMTs, one of the KMT's most prominent leaders, former president of 8 years, to the mainland and to demonstrate that the one China principle actually has a lot of momentum. I mean, Honduras is now recognizing mainland China, the People's Republic of China, as the rightful government of China. This is a trend. There's only 13 countries left recognizing the Republic of China. So there really isn't global momentum for separatism. And Tsai Ing-wen is a separatist. And that's why she's losing influence. She's losing credibility, because separatism is not just a political move. Separatism is economic suicide. Mind you, Taiwan and China have robust economic relations. Taiwan has a massive semiconductor industry. China has all the other high-tech goods needed to help that semiconductor industry flourish. And China is also gaining ground in the semiconductor industry because of how the United States is waging economic war against it. So it's economic suicide. Both your biggest economic partner and your biggest economic competitor, really, to side with the United States, offering you nothing, by the way. The United States is offering nothing. Just like Ukraine is getting nothing but chaos and destruction and war, Taiwan isn't getting anything but weapons upon weapons upon weapons, which will never be used. Many of them are just going to age and never be used, because a hot war with China would immediately go nuclear, and a lot of these weapons would likely never reach any kind of battlefield by air or by sea where such a war would happen. China showed during Pelosi's visit that it can immediately place an economic stranglehold on Taiwan. And if you think that public opinion on Taiwan on Taiwan Island on the Strait was already unfavorable to a war, because it's not favorable to a war. But if you already thought that, well, just wait until there is an economic blockade facilitated by the People's Liberation Army and their Navy. That will happen. That will happen. That is a guarantee. They showed it. There were 5 to 6 points immediately after Pelosi's visit where they ran live fire drills and they essentially surrounded Taiwan. And it was a message saying, well, if we did this in real time, not just a test, not just an exercise, but if we did this in real time, your economy would immediately collapse because nothing is getting through the blockade. And so Taiwan would essentially, be helpless. And then you would have forced reunification. So the United States has really backed itself into a corner here, because the United States believes that Taiwan is the best and biggest flashpoint. It's the unsinkable aircraft carrier, as Japan used to call it during colonization. It believes that Taiwan is this for its overall agenda toward China, which is to try to isolate and contain it and ultimately overthrow China, because China is doing what the United States absolutely abhors. It is de-dollarizing. It is, as Michael Hudson said, keeping finance and keeping the commanding heights of the economy in public hands and government hands. It's creating an economy that benefits the people. It's integrating with the world in a manner that means that its economic influence will not just be in how big China is economically as the biggest economic system in the world and the biggest economy in GDP terms in the world very soon, but it's also going to be the most influential with trade partnerships and initiatives like the Belt and Road, like Shanghai Cooperation Organization, like the BRICS, all of which it maintains a leadership role over, and all of which have attracted immense interest from the global South, to the point where China is the biggest trading partner for most countries in the world, but its handlings and dealings in the global South are only increasing in Africa, Asia, Latin America, the Caribbean, etc. And it doesn't matter who governs these countries, because all of them are saying, oh, yeah, we can use that. We can use those roads. We can use those bridges. We can use those trains. We could use all of what can be offered, that infrastructure around high tech, around telecommunications. We can use all of that. And so the United States is lashing back out at China, saying, well, we'll try to isolate you through Taiwan, and we'll risk nuclear proliferation in the process. And we'll do it not just with around Taiwan. We'll form AUKUS. We will create these military alliances and so-called political alliances to try to isolate and contain. They won't really have much teeth to them in the sense that they don't offer very much, right? When is Australia getting those nuclear submarines? I don't know, 2 generations from now? Like that's, but it just shows what the United States' agenda is. It's to build up to war with China. And you have top officials, right? In the United States' military apparatus talking about war with China very openly. And so this visit from Tsai Ing-wen, this visit to the United States, if she meets with Kevin McCarthy, expect China to take very similar measures. Relations between the US and China will deteriorate. There will likely be communication channels severed even further. There will be military exercises. They've actually been happening as we speak. They've been happening for days along the Taiwan Strait and in the East China Sea, because China is saying we can do things. They're not being covered, but China is saying, well, we can do things militarily. We will be prepared. So it's a dangerous escalation, but what it all speaks to is that Taiwan is really where the U.S. is going to die. I mean, that's where it's seeking to bury itself. Ukraine was a huge project of digging further this massive global graveyard for U.S. hegemony, and Taiwan will be the finishing touches, because there is really no other option but nuclear around this question, nuclear war. It's very unclear if large sections of capital will want such a war. But it's also very clear that the trend that has occurred, the trend that this Taiwan situation really reflects, this trend of China's leadership in a multipolar world, that trend is not stopping. It's accelerating. And China's legitimacy is only growing, as the Honduras development really shows us. So that's really it for Taiwan. I mean, this is really a failed effort from the beginning, but the escalations keep on coming, and we can expect them to keep on coming for months and years to come, so long as there isn't significant political shifts on the island of Taiwan, which may be coming. In the United States, unlikely to be coming anytime soon. And China will just continue to go about its business and continue to adhere to one China, promote one China, and respond in kind. And retaliation is coming. We'll see how extreme that retaliation will be. But, China takes kind of it follows kind of how Russia behaves, right? Russia didn't do anything for 8 years around the question of Ukraine. And then when the straw that broke the camel's back occurred, right? When there were massive escalations in the Donbass, when the United States and NATO rejected any kind of semblance of respecting a ceasefire and Russia's security interests, then Russia intervened. The same will happen with Taiwan, in the sense that China's watching, in investigating and researching. Just when will the United States also try to flirt with the red line, and that being a referendum for independence? Unclear. Doesn't seem like it's going to happen now or in the near future, but it's an election season in the United States coming up, and Taiwan as well. So in 2024, January, Taiwan will have elections, and then you'll also have presidential elections in November of next year. And there will be massive propaganda, massive moves by both political parties to try to look tough on China. And President Biden and the neocons happen to be in power. And that means there could be more escalations, because there's nothing that the United States likes to do more than to instigate and proliferate conflict in order to serve political ends. That is as American as apple pie. So we're all going to have to keep our eye out on this development. So that's all for the story for today about Taiwan. We're now over 2 hours here. But as I said before, everyone, do go into links in the description and support this channel, Patreon, Substack. You can hit the join button on YouTube. And lastly, though, I want to pull up something. I may have Carlos Martinez and Ben Norton on Saturday. I really have to see if that's possible Saturday afternoon. So that's the announcement. But to begin April. But I want to share with you an event. It's in the description of this video, and I'm putting it in the chat. I want you all to register for this event. Friends of Socialist China is holding a counter summit for democracy, and it's going to be great. So let me pull it up really quickly here. So there's a counter summit for democracy, April 2nd at 11 a.m. Eastern time, 8 a.m. Pacific, 4 p.m. British time, I believe that is, London time. So, you know, there's a description of the event. I won't read the whole thing. But it's about the escalating new Cold War. The U.S. ruling elite is consolidating a military, economic, and political bloc on the basis of its narrow interests to build popular support for its rising hostility toward China, Russia, Iran, Cuba, the DPRK, Nicaragua, Venezuela, Eritrea, Zimbabwe, and other countries in the crosshairs of imperialism. And so we're coinciding Biden Summit for Democracy happening right now with confirmed speakers who I think you will find of great interest. So definitely register for this event and the link in the description. So you'll Vijay Prasad, the Tricontinental Institute, who's been a guest on this show. Saeed Mohammed Marandi, a very good analyst and professor out of the University of Tehran. He's been on many programs. I hope to have him on mine soon. Luna Oy, who's been on this program, who is a blogger from Vietnam. Victor Gao, who is an amazing speaker, very entertaining, but also very politically important. He was actually Deng Xiaoping's translator, and he's a chair and professor over at Soochow University. Margaret Kimberly, friend of the show, a Black Agenda Report, Low Key, who is a British rapper and a journalist at Mint Press News, also been on this show. Carlos Ron, who is a vice minister in Venezuela and the president of the Simon Bolivar Institute. We have Ben Norton of the Geopolitical Economy Report, Powell Wargan of the Progressive International, Ju Hyun Park, who is of No Dut Doll, who's been on this show a couple of times. That organization has been on this show a couple of times. And Kala Walsh, who's a young activist from the National Network on Cuba, the co-chair of it. She's also very dedicated, very just, you know, inspiring in terms of her commitment to the peace movement. So you'll want to check that out, okay? Check that out in the link in the description. All right, register, watch, and be sure to be sure to support. So thanks so much for all the super chats, everyone. I see Valley here. I saw you out in I believe you were on the Duran stream, correct? Let me know if you want to be a moderator too, if you like to moderate. I've seen you here multiple times now, quite frequently. I appreciate it. Appreciate your support. Thank you for the super sticker. Yeah, so let's see. All right, let's see. Let me just give some shout outs and then I'll head out of here. Somebody's saying, please, Danny, more Pepe Escobar. I'm trying. I am trying to work it out, Pepe. This guy is all over. He's in Russia. He's everywhere. Thank you for reminding me to reach back out because I want Pepe in April. We'll make it work in April. I promise you. It's just he's a busy guy. There will be Pepe Escobar on this show. So thank you for reminding me in the chat. Let me it's a perfect time to talk to Pepe Escobar too, with all that's been going on. Let me see. Who else? So that's another thing. You become a paid member on Patreon and on Substack or on YouTube. You can suggest guests. You can send me guest suggestions and also ask the questions. There's a lot of ways you can plug in and help contribute. Jeez, these sirens today, right? It's ridiculous. So Rob, thanks so much for the super chat. Appreciate the mention of me. I try with Michael and most guests. It depends on the guest. Sometimes I'm more conversational, but with Michael, I try to give him. He usually has something he's coming out with too because he's so prolific. So I try to give him most of the time. Some people like more half and half, but I try to just give him most of the time. Thank you so much for the super chat. Let's see. All right. We're moving and shaking here. Thanks to all the moderators too. Thanks for all the moderators. Let's see. Thanks to all the moderators answering people's questions. Really great stuff there. I know there's more. I feel like there was a pretty big amount in the beginning. We're at 2 hours and 15 minutes, guys. All right, we got a super sticker from David. Thanks so much, David, for coming back to the program. Love to see the regular folks here. Love the new folks who come onto this channel, but love to see the regular folks here. Ralph, thanks so much for that super chat without the chat. Let's see. Anything else here? Yes, we have another super chat without a chat. Ari, thanks so much. Not that it is not mandatory to say anything in your super chats, but thanks so much, Vilma, for your super sticker. That's really generous. Let's see. And thank you so much to the moderators again for putting out there that on Substack there's free notifications, Telegram, t.me/Danny Dhaiphong. Get on there so you get notified, because I noticed today, thanks again, David, noticed today that the notifications were very poor. And that's been happening on my clipped videos too. We get statistics and numbers, and you can see how the notifications are very low in number, like the number of viewers you get from them. I have almost, maybe today, it'll end up being 49.1 thousand subscribers. In terms of notifications, it can just be in the hundreds of viewers. So when you think about that ratio, pretty poor, right? That's kind of the story. The YouTube really loves to rely on its algorithm, and that algorithm is totally rigged. So Michael Hudson is the most reasonable economist. The best, says David. What a great, thank you so much. You've been so generous today. That was a really generous contribution. David Falconer says, Professor Hudson makes everything so clear. Thanks so much for that super chat. I think there's a few others, or maybe not, but let me continue to go up. So again, Saturday, save the date. I'm going to try to work that out with Carlos Martinez and Ben Norton to have a stream here to promote our Summit for Democracy, Counter Summit for Democracy event again, and to talk about the latest developments. You know, there's so many things to talk about when it comes to China and the changing world order, this multipolar world. It's been a whirlwind of the last few days. Sometimes, I mean, I wasn't live for a while because I was like, well, you know, I could do a stream, Ukraine update, that kind of thing, but I was like, no, you know, I wanted to talk about something new, and lo and behold, you know, I got Michael Hudson on, and boom, a few very important developments. So John says the people's victory is inevitable as a rising sun. Cosmic law. It can't be too easy, nor can it be too difficult. Keep fighting. The best is yet to come. Thanks, John, for that inspiration and that super chat. That's great. Indeed, I do believe it is both difficult and very easy because of the conditions that we face. Thanks so much, Ophelia. Thanks both for all that you do. You say hit the like. Thanks so much. Yes, continue to hit that like button, guys, because we have 791 likes now, but we were lagging behind for most of the stream. That's quite typical. But, you know, the earlier we get those likes in, the better. The earlier we get them in, the better. So I think that's all for the super chats. So the earlier we do it, the better YouTube kind of quote unquote rewards this. All right. So let's see. Yeah, I'm on. So some people say it's cool I'm on early. I'll be on later. Most times, but maybe the next two will be in the afternoon just because of other people's schedules. Thanks everyone. Thank you for the good questions. It's always really difficult, honestly. This is not a complaint. This is just a reality with someone as prolific as Michael Hudson. There's so much to cover, so little time, and he has so much to say on so many things that it is one of the more difficult preparations. And I tend to not prepare. This is a little secret of mine. I tend to not prepare too heavily or in depth because I like the organic conversation that can come up out of our work. So, I think I already said that with Valley. All right, guys. Oh, well, look at this. Have you listened to Loki's No to NATO speech? I have not. I've listened to Richard Medhurst, but I have not. I want anything you have to say about it. I do want Loki back on the show soon. I want to reach out to him actually. So you just reminded me. Anything I should know? Generally, he's very solid on all things foreign policy. Most things. I mean, he was a big inspiration of mine. Certainly, he was one of the first politically inclined rappers that I found like a decade or so ago. He's been around for a while. Also a very nice guy. Like Loki is a very, very cool, very nice guy. From the one time I had him on this program early before people started coming to my streams. Very nice guy. Very nice guy. So Vilma, thanks so much for that super sticker as well. Big speech about China. I wonder what he said. I'm always wondering what people say about China, but I remember when he was on my show, he gave a huge history lesson and much about solidarity. It was very interesting and I really liked it. So I do want to have him back on. He's very smart. I mean, he's been to, I think he was educated at School of African Oriental Studies. So thank you so much, everyone. Anyway, you all joggle my mind for Pepe and Loki. I got to get on that. Brian Berletic also will be back on the show April 9th, I believe. That's a Sunday. So he comes on monthly. So get ready for that. Pepe, hopefully, Loki. These are great ideas for the coming month. I've been enjoying my conversations with Scott Ritter. So he might be on again next month if he has availability because he's fun to talk to. Honestly, that's like, I mean, not to say that he doesn't have just an immense amount of knowledge and analysis that's so valuable on these issues, but he's also just a really fun guy to talk to. So he'll be on, and then maybe this Saturday, Carlos and Ben Norton, which will be very interesting. But all that said, everyone, I've kept myself here long enough. I need to eat, take care of matters. April 17th, supposedly I have jury duty. Pray for me that I don't have to complete it. And I don't have to take like a massive time off. So with all that said, everyone, I heard someone said Breakthrough News. Yeah, check out Breakthrough News if you're here. Hopefully to get Rania on this show and Eugene hopefully soon. Have a fabulous weekend. As Valley said, take care, everyone. Thank you for supporting this program. Hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, support the program. The links in the description, Patreon, Substack, join our YouTube membership community. Thanks so much. Take care. Peace out.